June 1944, somewhere over the Philippine Sea. The sky was blinding, a white blaze of sunlight reflected off endless water, broken only by the glint of aluminum wings. At 20,000 feet, Lieutenant Robert Mac McLaren gripped the stick of his P38 Lightning, twin engines humming in perfect sync. Below him, two Japanese Zeros arced upward, fast, hungry, closing the gap. The radio crackled once, then silence. His oxygen mask hissed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Sweat rolled behind his goggles. The manual in his mind screamed the warning: never attempt a full-speed split S below 10,000 feet. Structural failure probable, but there was no time. The Zeros were on him. McLaren slammed the throttles forward, rolled inverted, and dove, straight toward the sea, every rivet on the wings screaming in protest. At 600 miles an hour, the Lightning bucked, the controls locked. Then, a blur of motion, a pull so violent it blacked the edges of his vision. When he leveled out, two trails of smoke spiraled down behind him. He had just broken the rulebook, and two enemy fighters with it. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase of relentless momentum. The United States, having clawed its way across island chains and coral atolls, now stood at the edge of Japan's defensive perimeter. The long road from Pearl Harbor to the Marianas was marked by attrition, carrier decks slick with fuel and blood, skies filled with burning silhouettes of planes that never returned. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the undisputed ruler of the Pacific, was now stretched thin. Its elite pilots, veterans of China, Coral Sea, and Midway, had been replaced by barely trained recruits, some with less than 200 flight hours. The Zero fighter, once a terror of the skies, was now being met with America's new generation of warplanes, faster, heavier, and built to absorb punishment. One of these was the Lockheed P38 Lightning. Distinct with its twin booms and central nacelle cockpit, it was the U.S. Army Air Force's long-range answer to Japan's reach. Capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, it could climb higher, dive faster, and strike harder than anything Japan had in the field. Yet, it wasn't without flaws. Its twin engines made it complex. Its counter-rotating propellers demanded careful coordination. And its high-speed compressibility, a phenomenon where air pressure locked the controls during dives, terrified even experienced pilots. Manuals explicitly warned against certain maneuvers, steep dives, inverted rolls below certain altitudes, and sudden throttle reversals. But in the Pacific skies, manuals meant little when your enemy was closing at 6 o'clock. By this stage of the war, American pilots had begun to push boundaries, testing what their machines could really do. Training had evolved from cautious repetition to combat improvisation. Veterans from Guadalcanal and New Guinea passed down hard lessons to new squadrons in the Solomons and the Marianas. Lieutenant Robert Mac McLaren belonged to one such unit, the 431st Fighter Squadron, flying from the recently captured Saipan airfield. Their mission: provide long-range escort for B-24 liberators bombing the Japanese strongholds in the Bonin and Volcano Islands. The Japanese air response was fierce. Small groups of Zeros rising from distant bases, willing to sacrifice everything in suicidal head-on attacks. McLaren had seen what a single mistake could cost. Weeks earlier, his wingman, Lieutenant Carl Hanley, had entered a high-speed dive to escape pursuit. His Lightning never pulled out. The wreckage, when found, was twisted metal scattered along the reef. Compressibility had locked the controls, a death sentence the manual had warned of in black and white. But war was a teacher that punished hesitation. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, pilots faced wave after wave of Japanese aircraft desperate to halt the American advance. The skies over the Pacific became an arena of technology. Instinct and split-second choices for many. It wasn't about tactics anymore, it was about survival. When McLaren took off that morning, he wasn't expecting combat. His flight had been tasked with coastal reconnaissance, scouting for naval movement west of Tinian. But what began as routine patrol soon turned into a knife fight above the ocean. Radar picked up two blips approaching fast from the northwest. Within minutes they were visual, two Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, diving with the sun at their backs, a tactic perfected by the Japanese since the first days of war. The fight that followed would last less than a minute, but it would challenge everything pilots were told about their machines, the U.S. commands. Growing confidence in the Pacific mirrored this kind of boldness. America's industrial might had begun to tip the balance irreversibly. For every Zero Japan produced, the U.S. rolled out 4 P-38s or P-51s. Airfields, once primitive jungle strips, now spanned entire islands with concrete runways and radar towers. But while the numbers favored the Allies, individual skill and decision-making still defined life and death in the air. A single maneuver, executed or withheld, could change everything. And that morning over the Philippine Sea, one pilot would prove just how far a man could push a machine before it broke. In the summer of 1944, the Pacific was a chessboard of islands, and every square mattered. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam formed the Marianas Triangle, a strategic springboard from which the United States could finally bring the war to Japan's doorstep. For the Japanese, losing them meant losing the shield that had protected their homeland since 1941. The skies above these islands became a proving ground for both sides. For American pilots, it was the transition from defense to dominance. For Japanese airmen, it was the desperate struggle to defend an empire crumbling beneath the weight of industrial reality. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, once a finely tuned elite force, was unraveling. The rapid losses of veteran instructors meant new recruits were rushed through truncated training programs. Dogfighting, once an art form for Japan's Zero Aces, was now reduced to rigid doctrine, lacking the improvisation their American counterparts had learned from brutal experience. In contrast, U.S. training had evolved dramatically. Pilots like McLaren were schooled not just in flight mechanics but in combat psychology. They learned to exploit weaknesses in enemy aircraft, to use altitude, energy, and teamwork rather than finesse. The P-38 Lightning, with its turbo-supercharged engines, could climb where a Zero could not follow. Its heavy armament, 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, meant a single burst could shred even the most agile opponent. But technology came with limitations. At high speeds, the Lightning entered a danger zone known as compressibility, a condition where airflow over the wings reached near sonic speeds, making control surfaces unresponsive. Early in the war, several pilots died before engineers understood the phenomenon. Lockheed had introduced dive recovery flaps to mitigate it, but pilots still feared the moment when their control yoke stiffened like concrete in their hands. For McLaren, these warnings were not theoretical. They were memories, faces of friends lost, names carved into briefing boards. Yet for all its dangers, the P-38 was a masterpiece of engineering. It could climb to 40,000 feet, fly over 400 miles per hour, and return home on a single engine if needed. In the Pacific's vast emptiness, that redundancy meant survival. By June, the 431st Fighter Squadron was operating under new pressure to maintain air superiority as American bombers began daily raids on Japanese installations. Fighter sweeps often turned into chaotic melees, with formations scattering as Zeros dove in from the sun. Radio discipline broke down. Men disappeared. It was here that McLaren's flight, codenamed Razor Lead, took off for what should have been a low-risk patrol. Weather reports promised clear skies. The sea below shimmered like molten glass. He and his wingman, Lieutenant James Howard, flew at 22,000 feet scanning the horizon. Their long-range fuel tanks still hung beneath the wings, making them slower but extending their reach over open water. At 10:42 a.m., the warning came from ground radar. 2 bogies inbound, 60 miles out. The blips grew closer, fast, likely Zeros. Operating from Iwo Jima or Pagan, McLaren ordered his wingman to jettison tanks and climb. Within minutes, the glint of sunlight on rising aircraft appeared, 2 specks growing into the unmistakable profile of Japanese fighters. The first pass was clean. The Zeros missed, but they looped around, diving from above in a textbook slashing attack. McLaren rolled hard right, trading altitude for speed. His wingman called out, "He's on you!" before static swallowed the frequency. The fight was on. In that moment, everything McLaren had been told about what not to do came rushing back. Never dive too steeply. Never roll inverted below safe altitude. Never exceed redline speed. But war often forced choices that manuals could not account for. And as the Zeros bore down with guns blazing, McLaren realized that to survive, he would have to do what was forbidden. He would have to push his Lightning beyond the point of no return. The battle now shifted from doctrine to instinct, from engineering limits to human will. And it was here, over a shimmering stretch of the Philippine Sea, that one man's defiance of procedure would rewrite what pilots thought was possible. At high altitude, combat was as much psychological as mechanical. Every pilot knew the mathematics of death, closure rates measured in seconds, bullet velocities calculated by instinct. There was no room for panic, only precision. But courage was not the absence of fear. It was the ability to act despite it. Lieutenant McLaren's training had drilled reflexes into his muscles, trim for dive, check throttle, line up deflection. Yet none of that prepared a man for the sound. The shriek of incoming cannon rounds or the violent tremor as 7.7mm tracers stitched across your wing. The Pacific air battles were intimate and personal. Enemy faces sometimes flashed through the canopy for the briefest second, a shared acknowledgement of survival or doom. For McLaren, instinct was the bridge between survival and statistics. The forbidden maneuver that would define his name in squadron lore wasn't born of recklessness but necessity. He had seconds to react, and every nerve in his body told him to pull up. But experience whispered something else. The Zeros were light, nimble, but fragile. Dive too steep and they'd lose control. He would exploit that. In that moment, courage was measured not in defiance but in trust. Trust in metal, in physics, in himself. Before 1943, American pilots had fought the Zero on its own terms, turning, climbing, dueling. It was costly and ineffective. But the P38 Lightning changed the equation. It wasn't built for grace, and it was built for dominance. Its twin Allison engines, armed with turbo superchargers, gave it altitude superiority and speed that could leave a Zero gasping in its wake. More importantly, its firepower was concentrated in the nose, not spread across the wings like most fighters. This meant that every bullet from machine gun to cannon shell traveled the same trajectory. In skilled hands, it was a flying sniper rifle. The Japanese Zero, meanwhile, was optimized for agility, not protection. It lacked armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst from a Lightning could ignite it like paper. McLaren understood this balance intimately. He knew the Zero's edge was in the horizontal plane, but the Lightning ruled the vertical. Dive, climb, hit, and disengage. The boom and zoom doctrine became the mantra of Pacific air superiority. Yet McLaren's decision that day defied even this tactic. By performing an inverted split S, a forbidden dive meant to reverse direction instantly, he risked structural failure to reverse the fight. In doing so, he didn't just evade. He turned hunter. The maneuver was so violent that his flight instruments tumbled and his body nearly blacked out. But the P-38 held together, and when he leveled out, the Zeros couldn't follow. In one of the most dangerous moments a pilot could face, the Lightning's brute engineering became its salvation. The encounter wasn't only a clash of men, it was a collision of two philosophies of war: craftsmanship versus industrial might, finesse versus power, and that tension extended beyond the cockpit, shaping every air battle that followed. When the Lockheed P-38 Lightning first entered service, it was viewed with suspicion. Its twin-boom design looked alien, its handling unforgiving, and its cost nearly double that of the single-engine fighters most commanders preferred. But behind that unusual shape was a series of engineering breakthroughs that would prove decisive in the vast Pacific theater. Lockheed's engineers, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, had built something the world had never seen. A fighter that could fly faster, higher and farther than any other. The turbo superchargers mounted on its twin engines allowed it to maintain power at altitude, where most fighters gasped for oxygen. Dual engines offered not only speed but survival. A Lightning could limp home on one engine, something single-engine fighters like the Zero or the P-51 could never dream of. Yet, that innovation came with risks. The same aerodynamic design that gave it speed also created a deadly trap: compressibility. In high-speed dives, shock waves formed around the tail surfaces, locking the controls. Pilots described the experience as the yoke-freezing solid. Several early crashes were blamed on this invisible killer before engineers developed dive recovery flaps to counteract it. When McLaren pushed his Lightning beyond the red line, he was rolling dice against physics itself. The aircraft should have come apart. But Johnson's engineering gamble, Reinforced spars, aerodynamic symmetry, and robust control cables saved his life. It was proof that innovation wasn't just a weapon, it was a lifeline. The P-38's survival that day wasn't a miracle. It was the result of thousands of engineers, draftsmen, and factory workers perfecting a machine that could stand between death and sky. For the Japanese pilots who took off that morning, the war still carried echoes of earlier triumphs. In 1941, their Zero fighters had cut through Allied aircraft with surgical precision. Their reputation was legendary, unbeatable, untouchable, revered. But by 1944, those legends were dying faster than they could be replaced. The men who faced McLaren were likely among Japan's dwindling cadre of semi-experienced aviators. They still flew the A6M5 variant, faster and tougher than its predecessors but hopelessly outmatched against American firepower. Their tactics too reflected a fading era: climb, turn, and trust in maneuverability. Against early Wildcats and Airacobras it had worked. Against Lightnings and Mustangs it was suicide. From the Zero pilot's perspective, the American dive that day looked reckless, a desperate escape. They followed, expecting to force McLaren into the sea. What they didn't understand was that their own aircraft, light and agile at moderate speeds, became unstable at extreme velocity. As they chased the P-38 downward, their controls stiffened, wings shuddered, and stability vanished. Witnesses from other flights later reported 2 streaks of black smoke twisting into the waves, the unmistakable sign of overstressed airframes tearing apart. The hunters had become victims of their own design limitations. Japanese after-action reports from that month reflected a grim realization. The enemy's heavy aircraft are no longer inferior in turning or climbing. It was a moment when the myth of the invincible Zero shattered, not in a grand battle, but in small encounters like McLaren's, one by one, until there was nothing left to believe in. By the summer of 1944, these lessons were echoing across briefing rooms, factories, and flight schools. The war in the Pacific was no longer a contest of equals. It was an accelerating collapse of an empire that had built its air power on perfection, now crushed by a nation that thrived on adaptation. And McLaren's brief, violent engagement over the Philippine Sea would become one of many sparks in that turning tide. June 18, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The air shimmered under the tropical sun. At 23,000 feet, McLaren's P-38 Lightning cut across the blue like a silver blade. Behind him, 2 dark shapes closed the gap, the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese Zeros, banking hard, the red sun on their wings catching the light. His canopy vibrated under the rattle of machine gun fire. Tracers sliced past his right wingtip and close, too close. He rolled left, then dove, feeling his stomach rise into his throat. The altimeter spun madly as the sea rushed upward. The Lightning's twin engines screamed in perfect synchrony, the propellers blurring into invisible discs. The radio crackled with his wingman's voice. "They're on you, Mac," before dissolving into static. He was alone. Every manual, every training film had warned him, never dive too steeply below 10,000 feet. Compressibility, the invisible wall of air that froze your controls in, was death. Pilots who ignored that warning were already at the bottom of the Pacific, their aircraft bent and twisted from the pressure. But McLaren had no choice. The Zeros were faster in the turn, lighter in the climb. He had one advantage left: gravity. He shoved the throttles forward, flipped the Lightning inverted, and pulled into a split S, a half roll followed by a steep, downward arc. The world flipped upside down, sky below, sea above. The G-forces crushed his chest as the dive began. The altimeter needle dropped through 20,000 feet. Then 15,000, then 10,000. The sound changed, a strange howling that built in the wings. The control stick stiffened. His dive speed indicator slammed past the red line, 480, 500, 520 miles per hour. The Lightning trembled violently, nose down, unresponsive. He was entering compressibility. At that speed, the air around the wings had reached transonic velocity. Shock waves formed, altering the pressure distribution and locking the elevators in place. The stick was frozen solid in his hands. He couldn't pull up, not even an inch. The ocean filled his vision. McLaren's mind raced. At 6,000 feet, he should have blacked out, but he remembered something from a maintenance briefing weeks earlier. The dive recovery flaps. Use them only as a last resort. They were new, untested under combat stress, but they might restore lift to the tail surfaces. He slammed the lever. The small metal flaps beneath each wing deployed, vibrating under the force. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then the yoke twitched. Slowly, painfully, the lightning responded. He pulled. The aircraft groaned, its frame bending under 6 Gs. His vision tunneled to gray. The horizon blurred. His blood drained downward, and he nearly blacked out. But the nose began to rise, inch by inch, until the sea stopped filling the windshield. At 3,000 feet, he leveled out. The lightning screamed across the surface of the Pacific, barely above the waves. Salt spray streaked the canopy. Behind him, the first Zero tried to follow, but its pilot was trapped by his own aircraft's limits. The A6M, never designed for such high-speed dives, began to shudder uncontrollably. The wings flexed once, then tore away. A flash of flame, and it was gone. The second Zero pulled out higher, attempting to regain altitude, but McLaren was already climbing again, engines roaring. He cut upward in a smooth arc, coming around behind his pursuer. The Japanese pilot tried to roll away, on too slow. McLaren's gun sight glowed red. He squeezed the trigger. The 450 caliber Brownings and the 20mm cannon spoke in unison. A burst that lasted less than 2 seconds. Tracer rounds punched through the Zero's fuselage. Fuel ignited, and the aircraft became a rolling fireball. It spiraled once, twice, then broke apart midair. Silence followed. Only the hum of his engines and the hiss of wind through the canopy. 30 seconds had passed. 2 kills. McLaren exhaled, realizing his body was trembling. The Lightning's wings were pitted and scorched, but intact. He climbed back to 15,000 feet, scanning the horizon. His wingman was gone. The sky was empty. He switched to the emergency frequency, voice hoarse. Razor lead to base. Engagement complete. Returning to Saipan. There was no answer, just the rhythmic pulse of static and the fading echo of battle. He throttled back, his breathing steadying, the adrenaline subsiding into a cold awareness. He had done what no one was supposed to do. He had broken every safety rule the manual demanded, and lived. But as he turned his Lightning toward home, McLaren knew that victory came at a cost. The machine had been pushed to the edge, and so had he. The Pacific below shimmered in deceptive calm, a graveyard for those who hadn't been as lucky. That moment would not only redefine McLaren's understanding of flight, it would ripple through the entire 431st Squadron. His report, when debriefed, would challenge doctrine, engineering, and the psychology of air combat itself. Because in less than 30 seconds, he had proven that survival in the Pacific skies was no longer about following rules. It was about rewriting them. The report reached the operations tent at Isley Field that evening. Captain McLaren sat before a long wooden table, uniform drenched in sweat, his flight jacket still reeking of oil and burnt cordite. Across from him sat 2 intelligence officers, a squadron engineer, and his commanding officer, Major Robert Hawk Ellison. A single typewriter clicked in the corner as a clerk transcribed McLaren's every word. He spoke quietly, matter-of-factly, describing the dive, the altitudes. The moment his control surfaces froze, his voice didn't tremble when he said it. He simply told the truth. Ellison leaned forward. "You're saying you hit over 520 in a vertical dive?" "Yes, sir," McLaren answered. 520, maybe a little more. "And you recovered with flaps?" McLaren nodded. "Dive recovery flaps, just like Lockheed briefed last month." Silence filled the tent. Ellison exhaled through his nose. "You realize what you did, Captain. You broke the compressibility ceiling and lived to talk about it." For months, American pilots in the Pacific had feared that invisible barrier. Entire squadrons had lost men who simply vanished in steep dives, aircraft caught in the deadly grip of transonic flow. It was a phenomenon few understood then. The P-38's high wing loading and sleek design made it one of the first propeller aircraft capable of reaching those speeds. But at a price. Until that day, every manual had carried the same line in red. Do not exceed 420 miles in a dive. Loss of control is probable. McLaren's unauthorized maneuver shattered that limit. Lockheed engineers at Burbank would later analyze the gun camera footage and flight data. They confirmed what pilots had suspected. The Lightning's unique design could survive the dive, provided its flaps were deployed with precision. What had once been considered a forbidden zone in the sky was now a tactical weapon. That discovery transformed not just the way pilots fought, but how they thought. 2 days later, the Pacific erupted in one of the largest air battles of the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy launched wave after wave of carrier-based aircraft toward the American fleet. Hundreds of Zeros, Vals, and Judys, desperate to halt the advancing U.S. carriers. From the decks of the USS Hornet, USS Lexington, and USS Bunker Hill, American fighters roared into the sky. Among them, P-38s operating from forward island strips. The Japanese expected the same cautious, rule-bound pilots they had faced in earlier years. They were wrong. McLaren's after-action report had spread through his unit like wildfire. Pilots whispered it over chow, studied it in hangars, memorized his dive sequence, flaps, throttle, roll, recovery. It became legend before it was even officially approved. That day, American pilots began using the forbidden dive as a deliberate tactic. When Zeros tried to latch onto their tails, the lightning simply dropped, straight down into compressibility, daring their pursuers to follow. Many Japanese pilots did, and paid the price. The fragile aluminum frames of their A-6Ms couldn't withstand the stress. Wings bent, engines tore free, control surfaces snapped. One after another, they disintegrated mid-air, victims of physics itself. The U.S. Navy called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. In less than 2 days, over 500 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. American losses, fewer than 30 fighters. For the first time in the Pacific, air superiority wasn't just about numbers or courage. It was about engineering, about who could command the sky at the edge of control. That night, McLaren stood beside his aircraft, looking up at a sky still faintly glowing with the fires of battle. The Lightning's metal skin bore the marks of stress, hairline cracks and scorched paint, rivets loosened from the strain. It looked exhausted, as if it too had fought for its life. Ground crews moved between rows of aircraft, repairing bullet holes and refueling tanks. The smell of gasoline mixed with the scent of the sea. Ellison approached quietly, lighting a cigarette. "You realize," he said, "you've just given us something the Japanese can't match. Altitude, speed, and confidence." McLaren didn't answer at first. He just watched the smoke rise into the humid air. Then he said, "Sir, we didn't win today because we broke the rules. We won because we learned when to break them." Ellison smiled faintly. "History's written by pilots like you." He was right. Within weeks, Lockheed issued a revised flight manual, the McLaren Dive Recovery Procedure. It became standard training across Pacific squadrons. Every new Lightning pilot learned it by heart. The forbidden maneuver that once meant death had become doctrine. But deep down, McLaren knew the truth that manuals could never capture. No amount of charts or equations could describe what it felt like when the controls froze, when your aircraft became a falling bullet and the ocean filled your eyes. That moment when instinct and machine blurred into one, separated those who survived from those who didn't. He had stared into that abyss once and found a way back. What he didn't know was that the lesson he learned that day, the mastery of compressibility and speed, would pave the way for the next generation of flight. The jet age, the P-38's near-supersonic dives once feared, became data points for engineers designing the P-80 Shooting Star and, later, the F-86 Sabre, aircraft that would truly break the sound barrier. One man's forbidden dive had pushed the boundaries of physics, combat, and courage, and in doing so, had quietly changed the course of aviation history. That transformation, from survival to supremacy, would define the U.S. approach to air warfare for the rest of the war, and its echoes would be heard long after the Pacific fell silent. Because what began as a desperate act over the Philippine Sea had become something far greater, a turning point not just in one battle, but in the evolution of flight itself. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended with the Pacific sky littered in smoke and wreckage. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was more than a defeat. It was annihilation. The few surviving pilots who limped back to their carriers reported unrecognizable chaos. Radios filled with static, formations shattered mid-air, Zeros vanished into the blue. In a single day, the Japanese lost 3 carriers, 445 aircraft, and most of their veteran aviators. It was the greatest carrier battle of the war, and the last time Japan would mount a large-scale offensive from the air. For the Americans, it was vindication. Their doctrines, training, and machines had matured. They weren't the same force that had reeled from Pearl Harbor in 1941. The Pacific skies now belonged to them, and quietly, among the stories circulating through ready rooms and mess halls, one stood out, the tale of the pilot who had defied orders and lived. Lieutenant Robert Mack, McLaren became a symbol within the 5th Air Force. His report on the dive recovery was circulated in official briefings, studied by engineers and even cited by Lockheed's chief test pilot Tony LeVere, who confirmed the structural integrity of the P-38 Lightning in dives up to 550 miles per hour. The aircraft that had once frightened its own pilots had now become the spearhead of American aerial dominance. Back at Lockheed's Burbank plant, the war was transforming the factory floor. Technicians, many of them young women, worked triple shifts. Engineers pored over McLaren's dive data, integrating it into flight control revisions and stress analysis reports. The phrase, compressibility recovery, entered the technical vocabulary of aviation. It was no longer a mystery, and it was a measurable, survivable condition. By late 1944, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-51 Mustang all benefited from the lessons learned in those few harrowing seconds over the Philippine Sea. Dive brakes, automatic trim systems, and reinforced control surfaces became standard. The once forbidden maneuver now appeared in Allied flight manuals under a new heading: Emergency High-Speed Recovery. In the Pacific, word spread faster than official memos. Pilots shared the story like a ritual, part cautionary tale, part gospel. Some told it with awe, others with disbelief. They said McLaren's aircraft fell faster than gravity, that he dove straight through his own gunfire, that the Japanese pilots chasing him never knew what hit them. The truth was simpler and far more human. He had survived because he refused to die by the book. Months later, McLaren's squadron was relocated to Leyte, supporting the American advance toward the Japanese mainland. His P-38, its nose painted with 2 red rising sun emblems, became an icon on the airstrip. By then, the Pacific Air War had changed completely. Japanese pilots were younger, less trained, often sent into combat with only a handful of flight hours. The Imperial Navy's once proud air wings had been reduced to desperation, and the Americans could feel it. There were still fierce battles, moments of chaos and loss, but the tide had turned beyond doubt. Every new dogfight reflected a single reality. The U.S. now controlled not only the air, but the science of flight itself. Meanwhile, on the home front, newspapers ran stories of lightning pilots outflying the enemy. Families read them over breakfast, proud yet unaware of the terror behind those words. The seconds when wings bent, airframes screamed, and men stared at their own deaths through spinning dials. McLaren's name appeared in an Army Air Forces bulletin, buried between mission tallies and commendations. No medals, no parades. By the summer of 1945, the skies over Japan were unrecognizable. American bombers roared in endless formations, stretching horizon to horizon. Fighters escorted them like silver phantoms, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and the enduring twin-boomed Lightnings that had once seemed experimental. Each aircraft carried with it the evolution of 1,000 lessons learned the hard way. The dive recovery, the stall limits, the forbidden maneuvers that men like McLaren had proven possible. Japan, once the master of aerial agility, now faced the full weight of industrial war. Where their pilots had once outmaneuvered, now they were simply outnumbered, outtrained, and overwhelmed by machines that no longer feared gravity. The Zero, so dominant in 1941, was now outclassed, slower, fragile, outdated. Its pilots were brave, but bravery had become a poor substitute for physics and horsepower. When Japan's high command studied combat reports, they saw a pattern. Every engagement ended the same way. The Americans dove, recovered, climbed, and killed. The forbidden had become their advantage. Within the ranks of the U.S. Army Air Forces, McLaren's maneuver was no longer whispered. It was studied. Flight instructors referred to it as the McLaren split, though never officially. Engineering reports codified its parameters, teaching future pilots how to pull through the sound barrier's edge without losing control. It was, in essence, the birth of jet-age thinking, a mindset that refused to accept mechanical limits as absolute. When engineers at Wright Field began testing experimental jets in late 1945, many cited the P-38's compressibility incidents as the groundwork for understanding high-speed airflow. The same forces that nearly killed McLaren would soon define the design of aircraft like the Bell X-1, the plane that would, just 2 years later, break the sound barrier. In that sense, his 30-second dive didn't just down 2 zeros, it opened the door to supersonic flight. The Japanese pilots who survived the war remembered those battles differently. To them, the Americans' courage wasn't in their tactics, it was in their machines. They spoke of the P-38's twin engines as if they were alive, of its ability to dive faster than anything they'd ever seen. Some even believed the Americans had developed metal wings that defied air. For the young Japanese flyers, barely trained and desperate, the sight of a Lightning diving at full speed was a nightmare they could neither fight nor flee. It was technology meeting faith. And technology, this time, won. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Pacific fell silent. The runways, once alive with the scream of engines, became graveyards of wrecked aircraft, and in hangars across the Pacific, American mechanics dismantled, photographed, and studied the remains of the Zero, the very machine that had once ruled the skies. They found its beauty and its fragility, its light frame, its agility, all products of a philosophy that valued maneuver over survivability. The Americans, by contrast, had built machines that could take punishment, dive faster, climb higher, and survive mistakes. In that contrast lay the story of the entire Pacific War. Lieutenant McLaren never sought recognition. He returned home in late 1945, a quiet man in his mid-20s with a chest full of ribbons and memories he seldom spoke of. His squadron mates said he spent most of his time helping train new pilots, teaching them how to listen to the aircraft. He died in 1978, never knowing that his after-action report, once buried in a Pacific operations file, would later be cited in U.S. Air Force training materials on high-speed recovery. His maneuver, once forbidden, had become standard reading for every test pilot who flew near the edge of control. By the time the jet age dawned, his generation had already proven one thing. Speed alone didn't win wars. Understanding did. Understanding the machine, the air, and the instinct that told a man when to trust the impossible. And in that 30-second dive over the Philippine Sea, when 2 zeros fell behind him in smoke, McLaren embodied that understanding. He wasn't just a pilot fighting for survival. He was the bridge between eras, from propellers to jet engines, from fear to mastery. His act became a quiet monument to what war sometimes demands, the courage to break the rules when history needs rewriting. War often reveals humanity at its extremes, of courage, of fear, of invention. In the case of Lieutenant Robert Mack McLaren, it revealed something quieter, something that would echo far beyond the Pacific horizon, the moment when instinct and innovation collided in a single heartbeat. His forbidden maneuver was not born from arrogance or defiance, but necessity, the raw, unfiltered reflex to survive. And yet in that act he unwittingly pushed the boundaries of aerodynamics, reshaping how pilots and engineers understood the air itself. It was a reminder that history's great advances rarely come from laboratories or meetings, but from men suspended between life and death, forced to make decisions no textbook can predict. The dive that began as desperation became data. The panic became principle. And in that transformation lay the essence of wartime progress, brutal, costly, and profoundly human. In the years that followed, the world entered the jet age, the space age, and eventually, an era of peace built upon lessons learned in moments like his. Every supersonic flight, every pilot who pulled through a high-speed dive, carried with them a fragment of that legacy, proof that courage and curiosity are often the same thing wearing different uniforms. McLaren's story, though small amid the vastness of World War II, endures not because of the 2 zeros he downed, but because of what it symbolized, that sometimes the most extraordinary victories come not from following the rules, but from understanding why they exist. and when they must be broken. Over the Philippine Sea, in the blinding sun of 1944, one man learned that lesson, and in doing so he helped generations of pilots to fly faster, higher, and safer, transforming the act of survival into the blueprint for the future. Just a quiet note about operational innovation under duress, it was enough. He hadn't done it for glory. He'd done it because in that moment there had been no other way. And yet the consequences of his decision rippled through every subsequent sortie. Every time a P38 or a P47 leveled out of a high-speed dive without breaking apart, it was his unseen hand guiding it. He had shown that the line between destruction and discovery could be measured in seconds. And courage. By early 1945, the Lightning was gradually replaced by faster, longer-range Mustangs. McLaren continued to fly combat missions until the final months of the war, chasing retreating convoys over the East China Sea. His once forbidden maneuver had become standard practice, and his quiet defiance had helped write a new chapter in aerial warfare. But the war was not yet over. The battles to come would be fought on new fronts: Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and finally the Japanese homeland itself. And in those skies, the lessons learned from the Philippine Sea would once again be tested, this time at the edge of endurance and morality.